Welcome, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about something that at Whitehall we have to deal with all the time, and it's overhead. Overhead gets out of control. Doctors call us saying that, they're not netting that much. They used to net more 3 or 4 years ago. Things have changed and the net has gone down. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's really staff costs that seems to be the thing that gets out of control, where their staff costs were 26%. It's creeped up to 30, maybe even higher. We have offices, staff costs end up at 37%. And they come to us, Greg, and they say, what do I do? Should I fire people? What should I do? Greg, could you tell us how we would look at that situation, what we would say?
It's a good question, because a lot of doctors, when overhead is a problem for them, they immediately think of what they're spending. Oh, I've got to get out of this big building. I've got to offload some of these staff. I've got to somehow make my life cheaper. There's a few cases where that might actually help. We found that the real heart of overhead is resource management, meaning what you're getting out of what you bought. Some things you've bought. You've bought staff. You've bought a building, even if you're renting it. You've bought marketing. You've bought patients. You've bought all these things. The real question is, what are you getting back? Yes, over time, staff can finally be so expensive that even by embracing better techniques of selling dentistry and getting bigger cases and all that, we can still be too far. That can happen. But I would first look at some of the fundamentals. I was stuck on a cruise ship once. Sounds like rough duty, but somebody had to do it.
Yeah.
I made a spreadsheet, little program where I put in different numbers in new patients and case acceptance and all these different metrics, and nothing had more impact on net than case acceptance. In other words, the people that had bigger cases had a better net.
I remember you had even people's salaries kind of listed out. You had like 10 employees and people making 18, 20, and you would drive them down to $14 an hour, like embarrassing wages. And yeah, it had some impact, but really the big thing was, just like you said, case acceptance really drove it.
Patients aren't free. We have to have a great office to inspire them to refer, or worse, we have to spend $200-300, and we know doctors spending $1,000 per phone call in marketing. So they spend all this money, patients show up, and they kind of drop the ball. They don't know how to get the patients to accept the case, follow through, pay for it, etc. They don't really know a lot of the dynamics. For example, we found one of the biggest problems in case acceptance is over-presentation, selling too much. And so if your overhead's out of whack and you're thinking, well, I'll just go for big cases, well, that tends to backfire also. It's resource management. You've got a building. That should be costing you between 7 and 10% of your gross. 7 later in the game, 10 early in the game. Early means you just moved in, but you should be able to make a building pay. You've got a staff, and you should be able to get their cost, in that 22 to 26, 27% range with some incentives. It could even be 2 or 3% more. And offices that do this, where they have incentives and the staff costs are higher, tend to have a better net. They're looking at a net of 38%, which is kind of considered ideal in a regular bread and butter practice. There's so many trade-offs in dentistry, but overhead, if you want to net good, you got to get good patients, which you can do now with marketing and geofencing. You can get good patients through the door, and you want to get good at getting them to accept the dentistry they actually need. There's a process. You got to follow the steps. And when they do, and you collect the money, you find that just about everything falls into place. So the first place I would start is to look at my case acceptance, what people are buying, what I'm paying to get them through the door. Well, it's not just that. We pay to get them to call on the phone. And then are we getting them through the door? Are they buying dentistry? Are they paying for it? Are they referring their friends? What are we getting for what we've already paid for? That's called productivity or resource management. It covers a lot of areas. One is knowing what gives you a good return. Let me give you an example. I know a doctor that took his gigantic staff on a vacation, and it cost him, about $100,000. And he found a couple of months later, he really didn't like his net profit. It was just galling him. And as I'm talking with staff, because they're tired of hearing him complain about it, I mentioned that, well, hey, you guys, you all got to go on vacation. He said, that isn't where we wanted to go. That isn't what we wanted to do. In other words, you can spend money in practice and not get the return. Right now in digital marketing, $200 will get you a steady stream of great patients, $200 per call. If you got the Google reviews to back it up. And then, yes, you should look at your other cost factors. I know, Wes, you have really made a study of the cost of supplies and so forth. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, labs and supplies in any office, if you just add the two together, you should be below 16% or below. That's kind of the baseline. That's what's average. Obviously, if you get really efficient, you can be at 10% for sure. See offices slightly lower than that. But certainly 16% is just normal. So anything above that, yeah, I would say there's some room for improvement. There's slop in there. I'll tell you, you're absolutely right. The biggest problem that I see is not there. It's not, how much you're spending for this and how much you're spending for that. It really has to do with how you're capitalizing on what you've bought. Like you said, you've got staff, equipment, you've bought patients, even though they're existing patients coming in for hygiene. You have to have a hygienist, you have to have a front desk. Even if you do hardly any dentistry at all, there's all this cost involved in just having this hygiene machine in the practice.
You probably learned this the hard way when you bring in an associate and it finally becomes clear you got to have, like you said, front desk person, they've got to have an assistant, got to have a hygienist, and then they can't produce dentistry after you bought them patients.
Right. It all comes down to case acceptance. Offices that struggle with high overhead, like you're talking about, typically have a lot of volume, a lot of patient flow, and they're just not capitalizing off of them for whatever reason. Sometimes it's capacity. First thing I'd ask the doctor, are you full? And if he's full, can't even capitalize on it. It might be because they're slow. Could be the lack of operatories to actually do the dentistry. But if I can paint you a scenario of high staff costs right now, take 4 operatories, 3 of them are for hygiene and new patients, and 1 is for the doctor to produce. You're going to have 2 or 3 front desk person just to process all those patients coming and flowing through the practice. And you only have 1 restorative op to do dentistry out of. You're going to struggle to produce 30 or 40,000 out of 1 operatory. Anything much above that, you're going to have high staff costs.
What you're really saying is there's a balance that has to be achieved. For example, we need enough hygiene to keep the operatories full for restorative. We need enough marketing to bring that across. Let me give you an example. When it's out of balance, when we sell too hard, and I know doctors that do this, they're very assertive, very charming, and they sell big cases, and they don't have any referrals, no follow-on. In fact, they get bad reviews. They push too hard. It's a balancing act.
It's a perfect example when you say enough. You need enough patients. There's a certain amount of patients that the typical office needs to produce 100,000, let's say, a month in restorative dentistry. There's a specific amount. And that number really is pretty static throughout the country, even when you go to Beverly Hills or Scottsdale like us, all the way to Detroit. That number's pretty close to the same all the way through, how many patients an office really needs to produce 100,000. Problem comes when you need 30% more. In other words, your inefficiency requires you to have 30% more patient flow to produce that 100,000. That's why your staff costs are too high. That's
Right.
why you have high overhead. It
Well,
takes too many patients to hit the number you're doing.
I've seen doctors get so many new patients. I ran into a doctor in Gilbert, Arizona, at 110 new patients a month. He's by himself. He had staff, but no associate. He couldn't produce dentistry. All he could do was exams and checking hygiene. He was out of balance.
You've got to have the right balance. Staff costs and overhead are really driven up by and large because you're inefficient in some way in case development in comparison to your peers. Because all this is just comparison to your peers. There's, we say 25%, 27% for staff costs. Well, that's based on the average, your peers. So based on what everybody else can do, you're inefficient in some way in case development.
So overhead is so much more than what you spend on gloves and burrs. It's how you practice.
Or even what you pay staff. And a lot of you, will say, oh, I'm overpaying. When we dig in, I'll say every once in a while we run into cases where they are overpaying, paying $28 an hour for a front desk person when it should be 18. We run into that.
There's guidelines published on the internet of pay in various areas for dentist staff. And you kind of got to stay with those, and you got to have a cap, because you wake up one day and you've been here 40 years and your staff's been here 38 years, and what you're paying is unrealistic. And when I say unrealistic, you might want to sell your practice, and the doctor that's going to buy it comes in and says, I can't afford these people.
Right. You got to stay in the zone of what's
Sustainable.
normal. We have doctors that pay a little bit more, a premium. Paying a couple dollars more an hour for a couple really good staff is not going to create this problem we're talking about.
Right.
You would have to really be paying everybody on your team substantially more to create a real pay issue where literally you got to either go cut pay or fire people. And at Whitehall, we see it occasionally, but it's kind of rare. So that kind of, as far as what we see, staff costs and summary, Greg, sum it up. What typically do we see as the issue?
You say to yourself, I think I have an overhead problem. After hearing this, my hope would be you would say, I get it. I'm underdeveloping these resources. I'm paying, too much for my building for what I get back. Let me give you an example. A guy works 2.5 days a week on a building that's there 7 days a week. He probably needs to put another doctor in there. I'm paying too much for my staff for what they're willing to do. I'm paying too much for marketing for the few patients I get. See what I'm getting at? In other words, if you feel like your overhead's too high and it seems like a mystery, start probing the depths of your resources. What am I not getting the most out of? And then you'll have some idea why your overhead's high.
And some of you will sit here and still a little bit confused, a little bit not quite sure about your own situation. After any one of these webinars, we offer 5 people to get on the phone with Greg and myself over the next week, a time slot for 30 minutes, where we discuss these issues. And it's not really any sales pitch. We're really going to try to figure it out for you.
And we don't make fun of people because everybody we talk to is doing something incredibly well, whether it's presenting dentistry or whatever they're doing something great. And we're quick to point that out. But we do find things that they can improve on.
Yeah. And that's the whole point. So if you want to talk with us, a lot of times we can give you the few little tweaks without having to join any kind of program to set you on the right path. And we'd be glad to do it. Thanks for listening.